conversations, quieting the noise. Carl Peterson from Peterson Pharmacy said it on this morning. The world that we live in is trying to make data-driven decisions for business, right? If there's no more speculation, shall we say. The executive suites that I work with, our companies work with, are trying to figure out how to make decisions based on real-time data, refresh data in an hour's instance, or whatever the case might be. Cody Aldinger is my esteemed colleague from KLJ. Wonderful human, great at what he does, good dad, good person, good friend, I don't know how else to describe it. An incredible technician. He's been challenged at KLJ as the director of IT and facilities with this specific task. The presentation is called Quieting the Noise, and it's Cody's methodology for taking over to figure out what's where, how to aggregate it, and how to report it to executives that are looking for data at KLJ. So it's my pleasure to introduce Cody Aldinger.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, so I had an introduction slide, but Brad covered it, so I appreciate that. As Brad mentioned, VP of IT and Facilities at KLJ Engineering, headquartered out of Bismarck, North Dakota, office here in West Fargo. So my first ask is, it's kind of funny. So our VP of Marketing texted me this morning and said, make sure you take a picture of yourself presenting today. And I'm like, interesting. How's that going to work? So we're going to go selfie time really quick, specifically for our marketing director. So selfie while we're presenting, if I can get it. Appreciate that. Did my job. All right. So I'm going to start off with a real-world example of, again, Brad mentioned, I'm kind of going through this now at KLJ. I went through it again with a previous company before this, but we probably can all relate to this in some way, shape, or form. We've got a ton of data flying everywhere. We've got large amounts of just different reports. Most of the time we're seeing that they're spreadsheets right now, right? That's super common. We got multiple systems that are providing these data sets. Our HR system, our ERP system, our sales system, you name it, you got different systems. We have duplicate information across the same reports. A lot of times I get so many reports on a daily basis right now, and I can see the same data points in 4 or 5 different reports, along with a ton of other garbage that may or may not relate. Sometimes we end up with different calculations for the same data. I'll use an example of utilization, right? You can define utilization in, 10 different ways. And if you ask the sales team, they might define it different than the production team, different than another team, right? Your finance team. They're going to define that data differently in a lot of different ways. Another one is turnover rate. That's a very common one in HR world. You can define it a lot of different ways. Sometimes you might define it one way and it looks great, and somebody else is saying, "What are you looking at?" It doesn't look great, right? But they're doing the calculation differently. We have different delivery methods, spreadsheets, emailed spreadsheets. Sometimes you have to go to the source system to get it and pull that report. We're delivering through Teams today. We're delivering through Power BI or SharePoint or whatever. Where do you go to get the information? We got inconsistent delivery groups, and what I mean by this is you might have a report that goes to your executive team, but it also might go in a separate way, shape, or form to your sales team, as an example. You're not getting the same report in the same groups, and then you get new hires, you get people that move on, and those groups are no longer accurate. Manually updated spreadsheets, this is a nightmare for everybody, right? It's my data source is the spreadsheet, everybody can edit it, formulas get messed up, data becomes inaccurate, and things get messy in a hurry. And again, the list goes on. You guys probably have another scenario that you guys are dealing with as well, but falls into a very similar category to what we're talking about today. So the reason for the presentation, how do we quiet that noise all over the place? How do we just kind of tone it down a little bit and focus in on what's necessary? The very first thing I can't emphasize enough is to make a plan. So many people will dive in and it's like, hey, this report, I don't want to get it emailed anymore, so I'm going to build it in Power BI. Cool, it works. No thought has been put into the bigger picture plan at this point. I call this the honeycomb effect. It happens with so many different systems, not just reporting. SharePoint's another perfect one that this can happen with so many times is I need an intranet. So I'm going to build an intranet page. And then it's like, well, I can also store some documents on there. So I'm going to build this other piece. And then it's like, well, I could do a form on here as well. So I'm going to attach that. And the thing honeycombs out. And now you've got all these siloed pockets without any thought put into what is the big picture. Typically 3 years down the road, you're rebuilding from the ground up. And it's rework, it's a nightmare. So I can't emphasize enough, start with a plan, look at what that end goal is going to look like for you, or at least an idea of what that end goal is. I like to call this starting with a blank slate. This is a common thing that I see almost every team, every process, and it's something I'm encouraging my team and the teams across the organization right now is to not think about the way things are today, think about the way you want them to be, right? Start with a blank sheet of paper, blank whiteboard, I don't care. Think about, if I could have everything the way it was perfectly, here's what I would want it to do, okay? And then you can start a gap analysis and figure out where are we at today and how far is it going, or what's it gonna take to get us to that point that we would really like to have. It may not be exact when you're done with it, but at least you've got some sort of a picture. You also have to evaluate who's on your team. This is something that, again, if you start building with a platform that you don't have the skill sets for, you're gonna have stumbling blocks all over the place. So you have to look at who's on your team, what are their skill sets, what are their strengths, what are the interests, so that when you dive into this thing, you're actually going to start making progress on it. Otherwise, you're going to continually run into roadblocks. Decide on your foundational systems. So I mentioned the ERP system, your HRMS system, whatever it is. We need to understand what those systems are and what the data source is. In some cases, you're going to say my HR system is our source of truth, right? Our one source of truth for personnel information, people information. So everything about the people in the company lands and lives in the HRMS system. That is going to be our one source of truth, and that is where we're going to get our data. You might also see titles, managers in your sales system as an example, right? But that's not our source system in the way that I'm defining it today, right? That doesn't mean we're going to go out to Salesforce and get the titles, because now it's got to be updated in 2 different spots. Go to that source system, identify what the source system is for the types of data that you use. So HR system, people information, your ERP system, financial, right, AP, that sort of thing. Maybe you have Salesforce, and that's going to be your sales data, right? What is that one source of truth for those different types of data? You also need to think about how you're going to move the data between systems, and I'll show an example towards the end of the presentation of some just different options to think about. I think we've all heard about Flow. We've all heard in the keynote about Scribe, some different options like that you can use to move the data. Next thing to think about is where are you going to house the data? So again, there's so many different options for these things out there today, but where will you store the data to kind of start bringing it in-house and centralizing it? This kind of goes back to your experience on your team as well. We can store data in SQL, but if your developers or your database architects are all Oracle, maybe that doesn't make sense, right? So, or vice versa. Or you may use Dataverse in the Power BI platform if you have somebody that knows that and understands it. So think about where you're going to store that data. And then how are you going to deliver the report? So again, we talked about 75 different ways that you get reports today. Let's start to hone in on what do we want? What's going to work best for us? Do we use Teams all the time? Maybe Teams is the place that we want to start delivering reports. Maybe we use SharePoint as our intranet and everybody lives and searches in that. Maybe that's the spot for your reports. Maybe you want them to go out to Power BI itself directly and start getting those reports. Think about how you want to deliver it. Maybe mobile is a key piece of your environment. If you got people that are out in the field all the time, that has to be taken into account. So if they're going to be accessing it on their phone, I can show you examples today of Power BI reports that were built without the mobile side of it in mind, and they look like garbage, right? So you have to have that end state thought in mind before you start. So this is an image that I thought kind of explained what I'm talking about really well in the different areas of the BI system. So again, if we go back to each of these things that I just talked about, who on your team covers the functions? What are their strengths, right? So if you look at this layer, we've got our data source layer, that's your databases, third-party apps. We've got the warehouse layer in the middle, where are we storing our data? How are we extracting, transforming, loading the data, the ETL process? The database side of it. On the right-hand side, the reporting layer is your visualization, your Power BI apps, whatever you're pushing that out with. So think about your team and who's going to manage these different areas to start. Again, what are the data sources? I mentioned Oracle, I mentioned SQL. As much as I don't want to admit it, sometimes spreadsheet is the right answer. I try to avoid that at all costs, but there's just certain scenarios where it makes sense. It's technically considered a data source, right? The ETL side, well, again, what system are you going to use? I've mentioned that I'm going to show some tools, but Scribe is an option. I know in the keynote today, he mentioned that Scribe wasn't working for them. They ended up switching to Power Apps, right? Informatica is another big popular one, a little more high-end and expensive, but does a ton. SQL Server Integration Studio, if you have somebody that's good in SQL, that's another option. On-prem versus cloud, so again, when we start talking about this section of the data warehouse side of it, Microsoft's online platform in Azure provides a lot of these options as a cloud option as well. SQL as a service, if you will, is an option as well, or the Dataverse like we saw earlier. The delivery methods, we kind of talked about them, and I mentioned the mobile side of it. You might have Tableau, right? That's another good option. So these are just the things that kind of fall into these different layers that we're looking at with this image here, if you will. So I'm going to recommend kind of a methodology, if you will, or where I would start with these things to quiet this noise, right? Like I said, there's so much of it, and you look at what Peterson Seed is doing, you look at what we just saw with Power Apps from Network Center's perspective, those things take a lot of time to get to that point. So when you're coming in and seeing this mess of stuff, where do you start? So you have to question everything. I mentioned going back to that blank slate. I'm kind of starting this process right now at LJ, so I'm using it to my advantage to question everything and learn about how we're using it and ask why, right? So you guys have probably heard the saying of 5 whys. I'll say 5 whys and 5 wheres as we start following some of these processes, and I'll show you an example here in a second. Again, encourage a blank slate mindset. I can't emphasize this enough as well, because this is something that a lot of places struggle with, is if you ask them how they'd like to improve the process, or how they want to get their reports, or how they want to see the reports, a lot of people will be stuck in kind of what they know today and make it a little better, right? If you ignore all the stuff that's out there today and get them to think about maybe something they've seen elsewhere, it really starts to open up the mind and get that creative thought process going. Even simple as showing them screenshots of other dashboards out on Google, right? A Power BI dashboard as an example. You can find tons of examples. If you drop that in front of them, it's like, oh, I guess it doesn't have to be a grid view in Power BI. It can be pictures, right? Opening that mindset with that blank slate, opening the mind with that blank slate mindset is critical to start from the beginning. So I mentioned the 5 wheres. You have to ask and trace where the data is coming from in almost every scenario. In most cases, if you ask where enough times, your beginning state should end on one of those source systems that we talked about. Okay, so I get a spreadsheet today. It's emailed to me weekly. I don't know where the data comes from, right? So we start asking the questions. I'm gonna send an email back to the person who sent it to me, and I'm gonna say, how do you create this? What's the process that you go through? They say, well, I grab it from over here, and this person emails it to me. Okay, now I'm gonna go to the next step and say, where did you get it from, right? So ask where, and in most cases, it should end on a source system. If it doesn't, I would challenge that you haven't asked where enough, because most of the time, it's going to land on your HRMS system, your sales system, your ERP, whatever your system looks like. So I'm gonna walk through an example, right? So I just kind of alluded to it. We get this report. I got it emailed from Jane Smith, so I'm gonna ask Jane Smith, where'd you get the report? Jane says, I compile it from these 3 different spreadsheets. How do those spreadsheets get populated? I don't know. That's where I get it from, right? I take this from here, and I paste it in the spreadsheet, and I email it out. Perfect. Now we go back to these 3 spreadsheets, try to figure out where do they get created from? Who's doing that? I start to look and see who created the spreadsheet. It's like, well, okay, maybe John Doe is the creator, so I go ask John Doe. He's like, yeah, I go into Salesforce, and I manually export them and save them onto this network drive, right? So now we've gotten to the point where we can say, okay, John gets them from Salesforce, and he's manually exporting them. Now we can come in and alleviate that entire process, right? Because we've asked the questions and we've got back to that source system. Now it's up to us and the team of people that are going to build this process to say, let's go out to Salesforce with whatever the platform is that we're going to use for gathering data, put it into our data warehouse, and spit that report out manually, and now you've just saved X amount of hours of manual entry. You've made it faster to get the data. You've made it more accurate and timely because we don't have the human error side of it. You don't have the Jane Smith is out on PTO, so I didn't get the report today. And if this looks familiar, right, this goes back to that kind of picture that we were looking at earlier, right? This left-hand side, your data source layer, we've identified that system. That middle warehouse layer, that's where we're storing that data, and then the reporting layer is your Power BI, your Tableau, your whatever you want to use, okay? So considerations, and again, these are more discussion, but just kind of experience of things to think about, and what can your team support? So not only what can they build, but how are you going to support it after it's out, after it's live? Does the team that built it have the capacity to support it? Hopefully it's built in a way that it doesn't take a ton of support, but it's something to keep in mind. If you don't have the team, you don't have the expertise, you maybe don't have the time, maybe you need outside help, right? In our case, we're using Network Center, right? So we're using Josh Nickel and Andrew, who was in the shorts and slippers earlier. They've been a great resource for us. We have the expertise in-house. We don't have the manpower to do all the things that we need to get done, and there's sometimes we run into things that we just don't have experience with yet. We have a good partner that we can reach out to help us through those things and kind of staff augment, if you will. The third one's a big one. Is the company ready and committed to changing? Okay? That's a big thing that you have to ask yourself and get buy-in and commitment before you even start this. Because if you go create a team and you buy the applications and you build out the foundation, and then you go to your finance team and say, hey, that spreadsheet you got, I can take it off your plate. And they go, why? It's fine. We don't want it to be outside of our team. You've just run into a brick wall that you're going to have troubles advancing if you don't have the commitment from the company and the different departments that are going to be involved from the start. Okay? How are you going to make it easier? This is something that I ask my team to ask themselves constantly. I'm going to use a perfect example. In our case, we have a Power BI dashboard, if you will, on our intranet. Okay? We can say, we already have this built. It's out there. The numbers are out there, okay? But if we ask ourselves, how do we make it easier? On our intranet, that little dashboard is at the bottom of the page, okay? So you got to open up the intranet, scroll down to the bottom. It's a little image that's hyperlinked to Power BI. So I click it, and then I get prompted with a login to Power BI. I log in, and then I land on the Power BI front page. It doesn't really have the data on it, so I got to click on it again to get to the data, right? So if you just take it at face value and say, we already got the dashboard built, right? But how do we make it easier for the end user to consume that data? So we're going to move it to the top of the page. We're going to have it auto log in based on who you're logged into the intranet with. We're going to have it display the data right there on the intranet instead of having to redirect out to Power BI, right? So now you've made it easier. And then I ask the question, is that easy enough, right? Let's ask the question again. Is that easy enough when I have a mobile user who wants to wake up in the morning, head of sales, whatever, and look at where we're sitting as of last night? He wants to see it on his phone, okay? He doesn't want to log in. You guys probably all know how hard it is to log in on a tiny login screen sometimes on a web browser. Can we make it easier? Yeah, in that case, here's the Power BI app on your phone. Let's have it drop right there. So ask that question, can we make it easier? And when you think you have already, ask yourself it again. Try to make it easier. If you make it as easy as possible, your end users will have better adoption. I forgot to click, but easy means better adoption in almost every case. Start small, prove what's possible, okay? This is a big key concept where if you are going to build your first Power BI dashboard and you make it 75 KPIs and it takes you 7 months to build it, people are going like, hey, this thing takes forever. Why are we going to use it when it can't get my data fast enough, right? Start small, show them what's possible with a small piece of that dashboard. As soon as they see it and they start consuming that information, the juices start to flow a little bit, right? Then it's like, hey, can you also do this? Can you also do that? And you can start to add that in to that dashboard. Process automation is a key one that I see a lot of. I'll go out and say, hey, I can automate this spreadsheet so you don't have to create it and you don't have to email it anymore, right? But people get a little bit protective of their data in a lot of cases. So, and they don't trust the fact that the automation is going to be consistent enough to get that data out in a timely manner, or that it's going to be accurate. So start small. Start with that small report that maybe doesn't have as big of an impact, and show them again what's possible if we were to automate that, and they can step back and see that, yeah, I guess what you're saying is actually true. The whole thing will snowball, I promise you. It's, hey, I also do, and it's going to be that one person that you started with. You did it on this spreadsheet. I also have this one. Can you do it with that as well? They talk to their friend, and they say, those IT guys, they automated this. I don't have to do it anymore. I'm a little less stressed now because of it, right? And they hear about it, and they're like, hey, you did this for Jane Smith. Can you do it for me too? The whole thing will build that snowball and start moving down the path for you. Accuracy from the beginning is crucial. I'm talking about this now with our team. We're starting the process of building those first few reports, okay? If we deliver a report and we're trying to show that small thing, and we deliver it, and the first week they find errors in it, okay? That trust has just sunk through the floor. If you tell them it's going to update daily and it doesn't, you're done, right? Like that trust is critical from the start on that very first report, because that's the thing that you're trying to be a Brad and be a sales guy, right? To build that trust right away, to say, trust us, we can build this thing for you, and it's going to make your life easier. But if it doesn't, the trust is gone. So you have to be accurate from the start, and you have to do whatever you can to make sure that it's updated, and that you're delivering and hitting those commitments that you said you were going to. You have to think about, too, if you're going to need any cleanup. This is a super common thing, and I'm going to go back to a previous company that I was with. We had properties, and I asked at one point if I could see a full property list from our ERP system, from our sales system, from our HR system, right? We had 7 different reports, none of which were consistent, none of which were accurate. We did not have one system that had a true full list of our properties and the address and the leader of that property. That's bad, right? And until you start pulling those reports and looking at it, you're not aware of it because you're not consolidating the information. So you keep in mind that you are going to have data cleanup, things that you need to address along the way, and you're going to have to go talk with the owners of these different systems and say, hey, I know this is your data, but I'm proving that it's not accurate. We got to get it cleaned up. And then you'll start to get that consistent data. How am I doing on time? 11:26. Data dictionary. So I mentioned early on that one of the issues that we have is that people define data differently. You might have a utilization rate that's calculated in 2 or 3 different ways. Early on in the process, start to get standardization. Ask the right people, how are we as a company going to define utilization in this case? So that there's no errors and you don't have people that are calculating in different spots or in their own spreadsheets in different ways and running into issues. So start to build out that data dictionary. Even if it's not a true data dictionary, at least make the defining decisions at the start, and maybe use tooltips or something on your reports to show exactly how that data is calculated. So it builds consistency. And then think about how you're going to handle new requests coming in. So I mentioned this is going to snowball, right? You're going to build the first few things. It's going to be awesome. 6 months from now, you're going to have requests coming from every different angle. And everybody's going to want what they want. That's going to benefit them or their team of 2 people, right? So you have to have some sort of process in place that you're going to consolidate that, prioritize what things are we going to work on and when so that we can start delivering. If you build every single thing that comes to you, you're going to end up with that honeycomb thing again, right? You have to be able to identify and look at the forest and understand what's going to be impactful for the company versus just that individual person. All right, so I mentioned the tools. These are just some of the tools that we currently use that we're familiar with. So our ETL, step on lights, our ETL platforms, we use Informatica. We have Scribe, Group ID is another one. So Informatica, we get it free with our HRMS platform. That's why we use that, and it's specifically used for that system. Scribe is another, I'll call it kind of a scaled back version of Informatica. It sits middleware between applications and allows you to build flows, if you will, between systems through their platform. Group ID is very Active Directory specific, but this is a super great tool if you guys are having to manage Active Directory user accounts, email distribution groups, security groups. It's a great tool to look into. Warehousing, again, SQL, Oracle. SharePoint can be a data warehouse. Again, think through your data and how much you're going to use. I wouldn't recommend it as your full data warehouse, but in some cases it can be beneficial to use a SharePoint list as an example as a data source. And again, as much as I don't mention it, spreadsheets can sometimes be beneficial in small cases. Reporting layer, SharePoint, we've heard about it, Power BI, Tableau, SQL reporting services. Again, if you got a SQL team, a good one. Microsoft Teams, and again, spreadsheets can be a deliverable as well. So, all right, so I don't want to just stop the presentation and say, let me have your questions. So I'm going to ask you guys just some basic discussion questions that I'm curious to hear your feedback on as well, and I'll answer them. So the first one, what business intelligence system are you using today if you are? So I'm just kind of curious, you using Power BI, you using Tableau, you using something else? Anybody want to? Power BI? How many are using Power BI today? Any others? Okay. What ETL tools are you using? So again, I showed you some of ours. What are you guys using today, if anything, to extract your data, transform it, and load it into other systems?
I use a EDI tool called Clio.
Okay. Excellent. Anybody else using ETL of any sort at this point? I know custom development obviously is an option as well to move data. SQL can be its own data mover. Okay. Are you guys able to house most of your, or is most of your source data already in SQL, or do you have to go get it out of other systems? SQL is a really common one that was kind of the end-all be-all years ago, and I know with all of the cloud-based systems now, these ETL tools like Informatica and Scribe are becoming more and more important because APIs are out there, right? All these applications have APIs nowadays, but you have to know how to write an API, and you have to almost have developers on staff that can do that, unless you can find a tool that can be that middleware that utilizes the APIs. Flow is a perfect example. They have all those connectors that they've built to a Salesforce as an example. That's what they're using. That connector is using the APIs that are available from Salesforce to give you that window into their platform to get the data out. So, last one. What's your biggest challenge in quieting the noise that you guys are seeing today? For us, it's buy-in. Be straight up, right? We're early on in the process, and we're having to go out and tell people, trust us, right? Trust us that we can handle your data so you don't have to touch it anymore. That's a hard thing. That's a hard thing for people to grasp onto when that's all they know is the spreadsheet of information that they're responsible for today. And then the question is, well, if you take it away from me and I don't have to do it anymore, what am I going to do, right? That's a real fear. It's something that you have to communicate to them to say, you can spend your time doing way more important, awesome stuff instead of stressing over manually upkeeping a spreadsheet.
For us, it's
Staffing?
We're just keeping trying to keep things working. We don't have time to implement new processes.
So the answer was staffing, not having time to build anything new when you're trying to keep the existing things up and running, right?
I think ours is you seem like you can ask question after question and resolve it, and you never get enough answers.
Yeah, so that one is asking tons of questions and never really getting the true, down to the true source or the true answer that you need, right? And you get a lot of this, right? You get a lot of finger pointing or you get a lot of, I don't know, right? The spreadsheet comes to me from some random no reply email address. I just do stuff with it, right? And they don't know where to send you from that. So asking a lot of those questions can lead to dead ends sometimes, right? That can be a daunting effort for sure. Any other big challenges that we haven't discussed? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good one. That's huge. When you got 15 people that want the dashboard, how do you get them all to agree on what it should look like? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For all those different sources, do you have multiple KPIs or multiple dashboards, or do you just have one that you wanted to see with everything represented?
I think in almost every case, you're going to have multiple. Now, do you want it to be 100? Probably not, right? It's a matter of finding, what is the smallest number without crowding the dashboard as well. So if you try to push everything onto one dashboard, the dashboard becomes cluttered and it becomes not as usable, becomes not as appealing for people to use. So you might end up with a high-level dashboard for your executive team, and then your department leads, as an example, might have a little more detail. But if you take that same detail and put it on the executive dashboard, it's just going to clutter things up and make it a mess, and your executives are only going to look at a few pieces of that anyway. So I think you got to kind of find the happy medium with that, and I think it's going to be a lot of times dependent on your consumers or who that user base is, on if they're going to have their own dashboard or utilize something else.
I hear the terms Tableau and Power BI used. I think they're interchangeable. I think they know what they mean. Do you have a definition for the differences between the two and when or where you would use either or? Power BI has become ubiquitous because it's included, right?
Yeah.
Asterisk. What do you think the differences are? Is that worth talking about?
It is, and it's something that we're looking at today, and it's something that my team, as they're looking at building this platform out, is currently researching today. I will say that 5 years ago, there was a stark difference between Tableau, who was already well established in the industries, and Power BI, which was relatively new. You were running into a lot of limitations with Power BI and what it could and couldn't handle. Even simple stuff like color changing fields, right? Can I highlight this text red if it's below 0, right? There's even limitations in that today, and a lot of times with Power BI. So Power BI is a newer platform still. It's a young platform. But I will say that it has caught up, and I'm having a hard time today finding the true differences between Tableau and Power BI. So then it kind of goes back to your team a little bit on when you're starting to define what you're going to use, what does your team know and have experience with? If you have somebody on your team who used to be a Tableau developer in their previous position, why wouldn't you take advantage of that, right? Why try to retrain them on something new if there's not that much difference anyway? So something to think about, or the Power BI stack, right? So we're using Power BI because, like you said, it's included. We use Office 365, we use SharePoint, we use Teams, we use the whole stack. So for us to purchase something new, it's a hard sell. It's a hard sell for me, for my team to say, hey, we need to go buy Tableau when we already have Power BI, right? Now, some cases it might make sense. From a Tableau to Power BI thing specifically, unless you guys know differently, I know Tableau is pretty prominent. I think the line is getting blurred pretty quickly.
Are they the two main BI platforms? And or is there another also ran that's another name that you're considering at this point?
So I looked at the Gartner matrix maybe a month ago, and I'm completely blanking what the other ones are at the moment. They were obviously two of the top players, and there was, I think, two more in that upper right quadrant. I'm gapping the names of them, but.
We were looking at Domo briefly too.
Okay. Anybody else using different ones?
Well, they build this, the Microsoft stack, like Power BI and the other tools to make it easy for people to use, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to be in IT to be able to use this. So how do you manage your users that want to get out there? You know, some of them are a little bit more inquisitive and probably be more able to do it.
Yeah.
Keep them under wraps with Power BI. They look at that and say, oh, I'd like to go do my own stuff.
Yeah.
Manage that whole challenge.
I have to be the bad guy and secure it. That's the only way to do it. We're doing the same thing with Teams right now, right? Teams, everybody's got the ability to click, create a team, right? I don't let them do that. We right, exactly, right? You turn it off. You're protecting them from themselves. And if you look at what happens on the back end of Teams, right, it creates SharePoint sites, and it creates security groups in Azure, and it creates distribution groups, and it does all these things that just create a disaster if you open it up. So We will open up certain things for certain power users that you're confident that you know. Yeah, I say it's a matter of handling it and kind of giving them direction on what you want them to do and what you don't. SharePoint's a perfect example of that. That's been a question for years, right? Since SharePoint existed, is are you going to manage SharePoint within a small group of people, or are you going to open up SharePoint sites to kind of have a team or a page owner, if you will, that has some elevated rights? I would say that start with least access and add in certain key people where appropriate, but I would not go the other way or you're gonna end up with a big, big mess. All right, running short on time, but last slide. So just some key takeaways from what we talked about today. Always challenge yourself and your team to try to make the solution better, right? This goes back to the easier question of, is it easy enough? Is it as best as we can get it? And when you think you've done it, ask it again, right? Deliver a solution that's easier for the end user, even if you have to fake it till you make it. This is, it goes back to the selling side of it and getting people to buy in and trust the solution. I have a perfect example. I told somebody that we would integrate and move data from here to here. I had to get it from a spreadsheet. It wasn't pretty. I had them schedule a spreadsheet to get emailed into an inbox, and I was going to move it into SQL to deliver the report. Okay. I got into it, and I could not get that attachment out of the email onto the file system to import into SQL automated. I was trying Flow, I was trying all these different things, and I kept running into roadblocks. But I delivered it, and I manually moved it for like months. They didn't know that on the back end, or on the front end, right? I faked it till I make it. As far as they were concerned, the automation worked fine. It did its thing. And when I forgot to move the email, it was like, hey, this didn't update. I'm like, oh, the service stopped. I fixed it, right? And now it's good to go again, right? So it was, oh, no big deal. And then I got sick of moving the email, so I finally figured it out and fixed it, right? But that's the fake it till you make it thing, to make sure that you're getting that buy-in and trust. If I would have just said, I can't get it to work, and it would have been 6 months down the road before I got it, we wouldn't be building anything right now because the trust wouldn't have been there. Meet the user where they are. Again, in some cases, they're going to be really restrictive, and they're only going to give you pieces of the information. They're only going to let you automate a small piece. That's okay. Take that and run with it and prove yourself and make that better going forward. Make accuracy and stability a priority. Gain that trust. And then again, start small. Do not try to take on the world. Don't try to boil the ocean, right? Start with something small. Show people what's possible. Get their creative mind thinking. Get them to trust the system. And I can assure you that it's going to take off. People are going to see what's possible. So that's what I got. Any questions, comments? Awesome. Appreciate you guys coming in. Have a great rest of your day.